everyone and welcome to my January reading wrap-up. Do not be conned by the thumbnail. I may have only been holding up 3 books, but I actually read 14 books in January. I just don't have physical copies of the rest of them. It was an excellent reading month and an excellent start to the year, so let's get started and stuck into those reviews. The first book I finished in January is Darkness Falls, which is the first book in the Darkness Falls series by Jessica Sorensen. I can't remember why I picked this one up anymore. There was reason for it, I'm sure. It was probably part of the TBR game. In fact, I think it was, yeah. And I think it was probably a free book that I'd had sitting on my Kindle a while, so it was quite surprising to me when I gave this 3 stars. The cover for this book is blooming terrible, but this is a perfect prime reason of why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because this was quite a fun read. I mean, don't get me wrong, you wouldn't go around singing its praises that it's the best book ever written, because it's definitely not. But all the same, I quite enjoyed this book. This is a YA paranormal fantasy novel, and it's set in a world where there's vampires and humans and these things called hires, and it's all just quite elaborate and quite interesting, and interestingly kind of introduced so that you don't learn too much at one point and you're always kind of thinking, well, what's next? And then you get given the answer and you get more questions, and it just eases you in really nicely to the world. I found the plot really engaging, the characters interesting, the backstories to the characters have left me wanting more. I need to know more. I'm actually already continuing on with this series. I can't believe that I'm doing that. I've started picking it up towards the end of last month because I wanted to carry on. So then the next book that I read was actually just one of these, not all 3. I finished my reread of Welcome to Camp Nightmare, which is the 9th book in the Goosebumps series. So this was one that I was always really desperate to read when I was younger, yet it was one that I really struggled to get a hold of, which is why I bought this bind up in the end, because it was the only way that I could get hold of a copy. It was like one that was just always sold out. It was such a popular book. So when I was younger, when I read it, I was actually quite disappointed because it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. The ending annoyed me. The ending doesn't annoy me anymore. I think it's actually quite fun and different. But yeah, the ending annoyed me and it just wasn't one I was bothered about. So this reread, I was like, how's this one going to go? And actually, I quite enjoyed it. I will say though, I thought it still lacked atmosphere in places, but I was able to appreciate this much more than when I was younger, and I found it quite creepy and engaging. So yeah, I gave this 3 stars in the end. The next book I finished in January was one that I'd started in December as well. There was no way in heck I could have finished this early in January without that, because this is Moby Dick All the Whale by Herman Melville. I had listened to the audiobook of this and actually I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I didn't think that it would necessarily be an audiobook that I would love. I was kind of pushing myself out of my comfort zone by reading Moby Dick in the first place. And so I was really pleasantly surprised and ended up giving this 3 stars. The next book I finished was another audiobook. It was really a month of audiobooks, January, for me. I just couldn't stop. So I listened to The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood. This is a book that I picked up because of What the Book Club read, which is run by Victoria over at What Victoria Read. And this is just such a fun book club for me because each month you read a Margaret Atwood novel and you work through them in publication order. So this is going to be a very fun project to continue following, I think. And yeah, it got off to such a good start because I was quite unsure picking this one up because Atwood's earlier novels are very much more literary fiction, and I knew I was going to be picking up the audiobooks. It was the only way I was going to access it because I didn't want to buy it. So I was like, is this going to be an easy listen? But actually, I found it an easy listen and it was addictive and I couldn't stop listening a lot of the time. This was really engaging actually, and I was so surprised that I was able to get into the story as much as I was. I mean, the characters were a bit, I liked some more than others. It was a bit creepy in places, a bit eerie, a bit frustrating, but I enjoyed myself. I had a good time. I was able to follow the plot easily, and I ended up actually giving this 4 stars in the end. The next book I finished was another audiobook. I decided to start the Wayward Children series, so I listened to Every Heart a Doorway. This was a series that I'd kind of always been interested in, but wasn't necessarily eager to check out instantly. Then all of a sudden, I was like, I'm just gonna pick up the first book, why not? Complete kind of spur of the moment thing. I just fell in love. I wouldn't say that I expected to enjoy it as much as I did, because I'm not necessarily someone who falls in love with fantasy. But this is a YA fantasy series that had a bit of mystery in it in the first book's case. So in this book, children can end up going through a door into a magical land, which can either be logical or totally nonsensical. And this first book follows a girl who goes to quite a logical land. And then when she ends up back in kind of our world, she ends up going to a place called Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children, where she meets other children that have gone to different worlds, and they're trying to kind of cope with the fact that they can't go back to the world that they want to go to right now. And it was such an interesting idea. I loved meeting loads of different characters, and I was looking forward to meeting those characters in future books. So yeah, first instalment I gave 4 stars. I then managed to finally finish reading a book that I'd been reading since November, and that is The Fountains of Silence by Ruta Sepetys. This is a historical fiction set in Madrid in 1957, although we do then get future timelines further along. And this is a book that I had been kind of expecting to love, and then when I actually started trying to read it, I really struggled. I received a free copy of this book from the publishers via NetGalley, and I was very tempted to DNF it. I think if I hadn't got it for that purpose, I would have DNF'd it, because I was just so struggling to get into the book. It was such a difficult book for me to get into, because the chapters are so short and the perspective swaps practically every chapter, and it was just messing with my mind because I couldn't get to know anyone, but I couldn't really follow the plot either, and it was driving me nuts. Then all of a sudden I really got into it, and I still found it quite a slow read, but I'm so glad I persisted with this book, because I ended up giving it 4 stars and I absolutely adored it. I'd have given it 5 stars if I'd been able to get into it from the beginning. That's how much I ended up loving this book. And it broke my heart, and it made me cry, and oh my goodness, what a book. Next, I listened to another audiobook. I listened to The Escape by C.L.Taylor. This is a book that I'd picked up because I saw it on Nicole's books, like, that she wants to read this year, following her A to Z kind of challenge. And so I'd put this on my TBR from my TBR game from that. And wow, what a weird and wonderful way to have discovered a thriller I didn't even know existed. So this is a psychological thriller that's very much a domestic psychological thriller, and the family, how do I not spoil this book? The family have some issues, and the husband and wife end up kind of seriously struggling to work as a family unit. I'll leave it at that, I think. It was a phenomenal read, and the audiobook was an excellent way to consume this. I got through it in like a day or two, and yeah, I gave this 4 stars, thoroughly enjoyed. Then I picked up a book that I'd seen Victoria read, review and love, that I'd put on my TBR, and this is The Land of Yesterday by K.A. Reynolds. I listened to the audiobook of this as well and actually really enjoyed it. It is a middle grade fantasy novel that's really whimsical and really quite heartbreaking. It's kind of weird to explain. So she lives in a house with her family, and the house has a spirit, and the family have some issues with the spirit when one of the family members dies. And it's such a weird read. Like, how this author ever thought of this idea, I will never know, because it blew my mind, and it was so creative and whimsical and heartbreaking, as I said. And oh my goodness, if you've never heard of this book, you need to check it out and see whether it's something you would enjoy, because it's definitely worth the read if you think you'll like it. Because wow, this book, I'm blown away. I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did, and I ended up flying through it and giving it 4 stars. Then after that, I read The Keiths Quotient by Helen Hoang, and this was my first 5-star read of this year. I adored this. I mean, I was always expecting to enjoy it a lot. I thought it'd probably be like a 4-star read, but no, 5 stars, because this book made me cry, it made me laugh, it made me obsessed. I was talking about it to anyone and everyone that I could. I couldn't stop thinking about it when I wasn't reading it. It was one of those books that totally consumed me. This follows a woman who has Asperger's, and she's in her early 30s, and she's having sort of trouble ever getting any sort of real relationship going. So she goes through a creative way of trying to get herself some experience and learn how to do everything in relationship, both sex and the other stuff too, like the emotional side of it, just the hanging out, the family stuff. And this is a really hot and steamy read in places, let me just say, by the way, but whew, what a book. I will definitely reread this at some point in the future. This is a firm favourite book of mine. Highly recommend. Then I read something that is really quite kind of out the blue for me, because I'd put this on my TBR as it's a non-fiction classic. This is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and I hadn't heard of this for some bizarre reason, and I hadn't heard of the Clutter family, and I was totally oblivious to this whole case. So that made this all the more gripping read for me. Again, I listened to the audiobook for this, and it was so engrossing. The way the kind of story unfolded, it felt almost like I was listening to a fictional book rather than a non-fiction account. It was just so well interwoven and documented, and I can see why this is such a classic, because this was just wow. I mean, it's difficult to really talk about this in terms of how much I enjoyed it, because obviously this is a non-fiction. Of me to sit here going, oh wow, I really loved the story, it's just not appropriate. But at the same time, that's how it felt. It was very story-y. It was put together in such a wonderful way, and I was gripped, honestly gripped, and also just disgusted that this family were murdered in such a horrific way. This book is quite graphic, so yeah, know that going in, but it's such a worthy read, and it's probably the least we can do to honour the Clutter family, to actually be aware of what happened to them. So I gave this 4 stars. Next, I decided to have a reread of Pride and Prejudice. I listened to the audiobook for this as well, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I've never listened to an audiobook of Pride and Prejudice before. Every other time I've read it, I've like physically read it. And it's one of my favourite classics, and it's still one of my favourite classics. I adore this book so much. I enjoy the characters. I've got such a thing for Mr. Darcy. But I also really enjoyed trying to pay attention to other details that perhaps I hadn't picked up on a first or a second read. And it was really interesting to just try and sort of pay attention to the characters in the background more, rather than be so focused on Elizabeth and Darcy. Then I decided I needed another fix of the Wayward Children series. So I picked up the second book on audiobook, and that is Down Among the Sticks and Bones. This book follows 2 characters that we met in the first book called Jack and Jill. They are sisters, and they are twin sisters, and this book I was not expecting to love as much as I did, but I fell in love with them, their awful upbringing. The world that they go into is just so intriguing. I honestly, this is my favourite book in the series as so far, and believe you me, I've picked up a lot more of them yet in January. I have no words for how much this book got to me. I think that this is such a creative book in the way it twists things that we kind of think that we know, and turns it around on its head. And I just adored this book. I feel like it's an unpopular opinion for this one to be my favourite in the series, but yeah, I would say if you've only read the first book and you were kind of a bit meh about it, you might enjoy this one more. You might be like me and adore this one, because the world, I was obsessed with this world and couldn't stop thinking about it, and flew through this book and gave it 5 stars. Because I enjoyed the second book so much, I jumped straight into the third book, Beneath the Sugar Sky, and this one I didn't like quite as much. I found it quite creative, and I found the characters and everything enjoyable, and the plot of this one enjoyable, and the whole trying to rescue a certain character and bring them back to life so that someone else can survive. I really enjoyed the whole plot dynamic of that, but it just wasn't as gripping as the second book. Maybe if I hadn't picked it up straight after the second one, I'd have liked it more. But I ended up giving it 4 stars because it felt kind of more on par with the first book for me. So then, because I was still totally obsessed, I then picked up the 4th book, and that is In an Absent Dream. This is my least favourite from the series so far. I didn't really enjoy the character that we were following in this one. I thought that she was stupid. I thought that she made some really bizarre choices. The directions the character went just didn't make sense to me. It didn't feel like, not that realistic's the best word to use in this series, but it didn't feel believable the way that she wanted to go about things, and I just didn't like her. I didn't agree with her actions. But I did really enjoy the world of the Goblin Market and the ideas behind it, and how this world was kind of formed and the rules that it made up. It was an interesting one, but it just wasn't gripping like the others had been. It was definitely, yeah, like I said, there wasn't really a sort of lovable main character for this one. And so, yeah, I gave this one 3 stars. That said, I'm very excited to continue on with the series ASAP. That is all I read in January, though. I'm really impressed with myself that I got through 14 books. That is definitely a record for me for quite some time. I can't remember the last time I read that many books in 1 month. Especially ones that weren't totally short. I mean, I know the Wayward Children's series is short, but I picked up some longer books too, which kind of cancelled those out a bit. But thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe by clicking the image of me if you want to see more book reviews and other bookish content from me, and I will see you soon. Bye bye!